When you'd look up Teknon Kyogo's Dracula Hunter, non-English sources tend to list it as having a 1980 release, while English tend to cite it as having a 1979 release. Except for one who'd listed as 1980 with a picture of a Japanese advertisement referring to it as a 1979 game. I guess people want to be doubly sure if something counts as a 70s game, or an 80s game. Whatever the case, Dracula Hunter is a game that caught my eye almost 10 years ago and has stuck in my mind for its striking visuals paired with sound design that never left my head. The well-done animated horde of Dracula silently scattering from a manner like insects. You, attempting to protect the lying body of someone donning a white dress, hurling crucifixes like boomerangs to a sound that I hear when just seeing an image of the game. While vampires were not uncommon in video games by this point, the way these move always immediately evoke one of my favorite kind of vampire, being the stereotype of them being stiff from rigor mortis to the point that they essentially moonhop at you in an unnatural feeling yet distinct manner. And this type of vampire is not something I see in many games. It also feels like I rarely see this game's awesome mechanic of enemies being able to dynamically turn innocence in gameplay having you face an outbreak in real time. There are yellow Dracula worth 10 points, pink Dracula worth 20, and red worth 30. But what I truly look out for are the bats whose score is listed as a mystery. While juggling all of this, you might want to consider actually attacking the vampire's nest by timing a good hurl when the doors open. I like this game. But maybe I'm in the minorities it's grown so rare that it's considered lost media, last being seen on auction in 2018, though it seems to have inspired the Sega Saturn shmup Dracula Buster before that, so I'm not entirely low. To shift gears to that whole market for a moment, the forward in the manual of 1980's House of Usher calls the works of Lovecraft and Edgar Allan Poe the inspirations to their work. This game is based on Poe's 1839 work The Fall of the House of Usher, detailing its protagonist receiving a letter from their best friend Roderick Usher, requesting their presence as they are ill. And upon going, the protagonist does what they can to help, but ultimately watches the mysterious illness deteriorate the members of the House of Usher. The game itself has you explore the puzzle-filled mansion. There are multiple endings from investigating and uncovering the mystery of the mansion to just robbing it. The game will also end if you stay until sunrise. Elements have been added to the story, and while the game has many great ideas, I found its sluggish movement a constant thorn in its side. The ambition of combating the monsters that visibly infest the mansion with limited resources like ammo and stamina is admirable. Like other survival horror games in this vein, it's designed in a way that would be good to replay and do runs of, if it weren't for that sluggishness. House of Usher is credited to John and Patty Bell, who are credited with a number of games that released under their company, Crystalware, who just a year later published Escape from Vulcan's Island, which is always the first game I think of when thinking of 20th century open world games. And it has that House of Usher movement, but design's a bit more rounded, with it working much better in my opinion to have this much vaster open nature to feel like you're dynamically running into enemies you have a much greater chance of avoiding, and being a bit more on edge in choosing where to go when getting the notification that an enemy is nearby. Now let's go fast-paced. Berzerk's focus was purely on fighting through rooms of electrified walls and fully voiced robots that was apparently a sound chip that was meant to help visually impaired. But the game designer, Alan McNeil, thought it sounded robotic, and fit right into his game setting. Interesting to me is a review from the time that called the movement and aim being tied to the same stick as a setback, and I can easily see how this would be far more controllable with a more twin-stick setup like Western Gun had. Berzerk is said to have been an inspiration for Robotron, which did exactly that. Berzerk itself gets incredible attention, and is still brought up to this day as an inspiration and historical touchstone of horror games, thanks in no small part to its pursuer enemy, Evil Otto. You see, in arcades you gotta keep the game moving, because other people want to use the machine. So once the player clears a room, you could introduce a timer that picks a room to teleport the player to if they don't choose one themselves. But that would rob them of their player agency, so why not introduce something that puts a fire under them? An unstoppable enemy named Evil Otto after Security Chief Otto, at the dev's former workplace, with no shortage of stories detailing how he was mean to Berzerk's designer, who combined this with the imagery of the stereotypical have a nice day smiley face that he viewed as a symbol of fake righteousness, with the game enemy being what he really thought of it, feigning concern to someone as you beat them down. It's such a masterfully fitting tone for the game's setting, which the Atari VCS port fleshed out to be a robot planet that you touch down on, with the oppressive Evil Otto leading the robots. While you can argue that enemies like Dracula and the Cat were earlier examples of pursuer enemies in horror games, Evil Otto seems to be the first big one that I see regularly brought up, causing players to drop everything and just run. And the coolest detail to me is that the particle effect of robots blowing up subtly forms his face. Though it's not so subtle in the VCS version that doesn't have that concern of getting you off the cabinet, and was able to offer a game mode where there is no auto, and modes where it can be temporarily downed, which would carry over into the sequel Frenzy, where you can face multiple autos in destructible environments. Berzerk is also attached to video game related deaths when someone had a heart attack while playing, leading to urban legends about the horror of the arcade cabinet. I've heard someone describe Evil Otto as being on the other end of Pac-Man, which is a funny way to think about it, but also can make you realize the interesting coincidence that both of these games coming out at the same time had these yellow orb mascots and pursuer gameplay. Now that I think about it, Pac-Man having ghosts does make it horror themed, or at least not too often glanced over when discussing pursuer horror, and there's definitely Pac-Man clones that people consider horror games, so let's give credit where it's due. While these kind of fast-paced and action-packed games were around, there was no shortage of that slower pacing in horror games. I've gotten into games bearing the Sierra logo over the years and was surprised to find people mentioning their start in video games was a successful horror game in 1980. The company was apparently founded shortly before by a couple to create business software, or at least that's what Ken Williams thought, before his wife Roberta, who was deep into video games, wanted to make her own with him, which sold so well they decided to instead become a video game company. Mystery House was inspired by the novel And Then There Were None, about 10 people being invited to an island where there are 10 figures on a dining room table, and a rhyme about 10 people meeting their ends, framed in their rooms, when a record plays, stating the date that each of them took someone's life. They begin picking off mirroring the rhyme, with a figure disappearing from the table each time, causing them to infight about who the perpetrator is. In the Williams game, you are one of 8 people in a house being picked off, trying to figure out who is doing it before you're next. Roberta apparently felt the game suffered from a linear structure before looking to the mystery-solving board game Clue helped her escape this. After Ken proposed they add pictures, Roberta essentially drew the entire game so that the player would always have something to look at. Many people view this as causing a fork in the road where text adventures continued down one path, and a new path opened up of point-and-click adventures. There is a charm to both the original and the redrawn art later released by StarCraft in 1983, the company, not the RTS. I interpret Mystery House to be from the perspective of your eyes, making it first person to me, which is a perspective you'd see horror games a lot more in during the 1980s. You know, a common misconception is that 3D computer graphics came after Pong, when they go back to at least the 1960s, possibly even earlier, often in the form of only rendering something's outlines on a black background, being useful for conveying depth, which could come in handy for things like VR in the 1960s. Yeah, imagine wearing a VR helmet with CRTs. Don't worry, they put them on the sides of your head. By the early 1970s, the earliest known traditional online comparative first-person shooter was being played nationwide. It was this game Maze War that made me think about just how unsimple these graphics are, because you have to determine the 3D object's lines form and at what angle they're being viewed from, to keep track of which lines to not show when they're supposed to be behind a solid surface. And of course, by the 70s you already had first-person games like Escape that had solid colored surfaces, but many first-person games would release in 1980 that had that Aka LaBeouf style of white lines on a black background. In Frank Core's Rat's Revenge, you attempt to navigate a maze for cheese before starving, even having the possibility to get to the point of hallucinating the cheese. And in Death Maze 5000, you will do the same as a human, looking for the exit in a 5-story building of maze-like hallways with monsters, puzzles, and traps before you starve. Wielding a torch, you'll actually need to maintain it, or you'll be left in the pitch black of the windowless maze. This labyrinth is beyond me. It truly is the Backrooms experience. The same year, Frank would team up with William Denham, who is the author of Reality Ends, a game where every single step you take is a different parallel universe, with the goal of defeating Baldir across the multiverse. William and Frank would combine efforts to somewhat bring this rival aspect to Death Maze 5000, with a game appropriately called Labyrinth, where instead of escaping being the focus, it would be the battle of who gets who between you and a minotaur. These Labyrinth-set games would become somewhat of a trope even outside of first-person games. In October of 1980, Softside published Joel Mick's Monster Maze, where the player maps out a maze to find an exit while trying not to run into the monster. But you may be more familiar with the later first-person version of this game, made by someone else. You see, half a year later, a Malcolm Evans would receive a ZX81 for his birthday, and wanted to see what it could do. He made a maze to explore initially in 2D before changing it to a first-person perspective. You could move left, right, and forward, but not back, which wasn't uncommon at the time. A John Gray from his Bristol Folk Music Club is credited with recommending he had a pursuer enemy, to which Malcolm looked to a kid's book and decided to draw a T-Rex. As he put it, he was making the game graphics first. As you're close, it will take note and become more active in searching for you, and dart right for you if you're in its line of sight. With an absence of sound denoting the T-Rex's position from you, text at the bottom of the screen serves the role of your hearing, and ironically, was added to ease the tension, but can really stack it on quite well. He also added the story that you've decided to take on this Nightmare Park-esque carnival attraction of trying to navigate a maze with a live T-Rex in it, warning you to enter at your own risk. Malcolm Evans had essentially made a first-person version of Monster Maze, and appropriately landed on the name 3D Monster Maze, being told it's good enough to sell. It seemed to initially be released in late 1981 under Gray's company before being re-released in 1982 when Malcolm started his own, sometimes creating a bit of confusion with when its initial release is. It looks most like a colorless version of 1978's Maze game, which was purely about exploration, with you being able to access your map at all times, see your footsteps, there's even a compass. But no pursuer. Now, 3D Monster Maze isn't the first horror game, it's not the first 3D or first-person game, and I wouldn't even consider it a survival horror game because you can't become the hunter. But people often call it the first because they call whatever is the earliest horror game they know at the time the first horror game. And they're more likely to hear back to 3D Monster Maze because it's such a timeless game. It's a much more simplified version of its predecessors like Labyrinth, and having that level of ease to get into it is probably why horror games like it are still made to this day, making 3D Monster Maze a recognizable form factor to people viewing it as being like the later horror games they grew up with. Evan would continue to make games including Corridors of Genna in 1983 where you attempt to take down a rogue computer and now can hear footsteps. He'd also make a top-down version of 3D Monster Maze called Escape. Top-down games still have their advantages. Giant monster games have always seemed to struggle with finding out how to make a popular video game, and especially in the 1980s, an aerial view would be the way to go. Years before SimCity would introduce kaiju attacks, perhaps the most iconic one of them all, Godzilla, would have his own spin on this in a 1980 game where you're in charge of making sure the country survives such a horrifying threat. Organizing Army, Navy, and Air Force across the country alongside decisions like missile strikes and nuking, with the game factoring in civilian and military loss as well as Godzilla possibly ending you yourself if he gets to the capital. Simplicity still tends to be the key with the novice strategy games like myself, and this is a simple yet variable-filled game to run subsequently as a quick, neat little game on your computer. I really like playing as the military in Godzilla games, but if you want to just play as the monster and wreak havoc, you'd be eating well in the 80s. The year after Godzilla's game, Crush, Crumble, and Chomp, the movie monster game would give you the opposite perspective, having you control a variety of giant monsters including the ability to create your own to attempt to destroy Tokyo, New York, San Francisco, and Washington, D.C., but not without them putting up a fight, including scientists racing to discover something to vanquish you. The need to eat can radically affect your strategies and willingness to risk putting yourself in harm's way to avoid losing control of your monster if they get too hungry, though you can play as giant robots who don't have to worry about hunger. I wish they had to worry about power, or something in its place, but it could be a more novice's entry point. I find this game to have an impressive amount of detail, like Godzilla's footsteps being radioactive as they were in Godzilla's debut movie. But with such a learning curve in a turn-based game, it feels like a complex board game that you might not have the patience to learn, which is maybe why giant robots don't have to eat. But either way, it's a cool concept that might make you more willing to learn, and these kind of games including more real-time attempts would be a thing going forward. While the 1970s is credited with much when it comes to video games, the 1980s are often seen as an even more iconic era, being a refinement of that previous era where video games becoming mainstream attracted tons of companies to all jump in, skyrocketing the bar of expectation. How does a young 20-year-old in the 1980s follow up the greats of their childhood like Pong, Breakout, and Space Invaders, while those veteran companies are putting out their next greats? I know video games have been taught in school since at least the early 1950s, but I imagine the leap in popularity of the whole market and direction change to focusing on the video part of arcade cabinets in the 70s opened the floodgates for the 80s to have a lot more milk for the cream to go through before making it to the top. And if none of the types of horror games I've mentioned are your taste, I have something really scary for you. Playful Professor Math Tutor is a game about being trapped in a haunted clown castle where the only way to escape is to solve math equations. I'm Oktaro.